Buenos nachos, amigos, and welcome to another fine episode of Record Breakers. I'm Petey Rave, introducing the show just like I do every other show. Here with me is my quorum of record reviewers and friends. We have Brett.
Ahoy hoy.
We've got Drew.
Hey.
And we've got Patrick.
Word up.
We are gathered once again to talk about music, just like we do every week. This week the provider of said music is none other than Patrick. Patrick, what are we talking about this week?
So, we haven't done a double album since an episode of this show I don't think anyone was ever forced to listen to, where Petey made us listen to The Clash, to mixed feelings, I think. And I picked one, Hüsker Dü's Zen Arcade.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating album, to say the least. I'll start with Drew. What expectations did you have coming into this album?
What I knew about Hüsker Dü was absolutely zero. Like, I went into this, I knew they were a band. I knew they were mentioned most of the time when it comes to, like, big rock and roll bands in general. Never heard them in any specific circles, but you sort of, if you're a rock and roll fan, Hüsker Dü is just one of the names you just sort of hear. I also knew that they were mentioned by a man with a mullet. And that was about it. With my knowledge of Hüsker Dü, as far as their music went.
Yes. Brett, what expectations did you have coming into this album?
Yeah, I never dove into any of Hüsker Dü. I knew that they were sort of that in between genres, sort of genre bending. I knew a lot of people that were influenced by them, and I kind of know what some of the members went on to do later, but I never really took the time. I probably heard a couple things and decided it wasn't Black Flag, so I moved on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting, it's a name that's out there and you know that it has ümlauts on there, but I guess none of us really have any experience with it. Patrick, what would be the themes and elements that make up this record that we're supposed to be looking out for?
So Brett alluded to not being Black Flag. So Hüsker Dü came out of the same sort of early to mid 80s hardcore movement that got you Black Flag, Minor Threat, the previously listened to on this show, Dead Kennedys, and several other bands that, are probably worth mentioning, but I'm not. And Hüsker Dü kind of had their own sort of, they started out basically as a hardcore band, but became more and more melodic and started expanding what they were going to try to do with the genre, getting, very melodic guitars. This album sort of was them really reaching, getting piano and weird effects mixed in and having a concept on a punk album, which at the time was, not a thing that had been done a lot. So this album, Zen Arcade, is sort of their, like, the one that's looked at as when they went from being a hardcore band to being sort of Hüsker Dü, the band that influenced post-hardcore grunge, alt-rock, and emo, and are the reason why Drew's like, I've heard of Hüsker Dü, but I've never heard them, is sort of because they influenced a lot of bands in a lot of genres. And they're one of those bands they're a band that bands listen to, I guess is the way to describe them. And this album is sort of their, I think one of the ones that is, their seminal record. If you were going to say you get one Hüsker Dü album to listen to, it's going to be Zen Arcade. It's sort of them at their height. It's basically two songwriters, Bob Mould, who plays guitar and sings, and drummer Grant Hart, who also sings, bouncing off of each other, layering vocals over each other, writing, distinctly different things, but ultimately forming a pretty cool, cohesive sound that is more melodic than the hardcore around it, but I don't think lacks any of the energy or attitude of the other bands of that whole movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a very energetic record, to say the least. I'll go with Drew again. Drew, what would be the themes and elements that stood out for you? What caught your attention?
Well, what caught my attention is, right off the bat, what I was not expecting was how raw that it felt. And when I say that, there's two types of that when you're talking about music. One is the raw, they're not talented per se, and they just get into the studio and bang out a couple of tracks, and that's it. And you can tell there's no thought behind it. And then there's the raw of, we don't have any money, but we have a lot of drive and a lot of like point, and we want to do this. And it shows. On my research of this, they did mostly one takes, except for a couple of songs. And that sort of shows in the fidelity. Now, the quality of the actual music you're getting is fantastic. And for a band to sort of be on the tongues of people as like a classic album or a classic band and sort of be that inspiration and not be something that was in the studio for a while or spent a lot of money on and stuff like that, that's something that's in the punk scene very, very common, but you don't see it going outside of the punk scene a lot into like the greater alt rock scene, in my opinion. And Hüsker Dü does that greatly here. The thread is very thin on the concept, I think, and that's not to their detriment, in my opinion. I think that works really, really well, especially with that sort of blending of the punk rock with other genres, your more folky ones and your more psychedelic ones and stuff like that, but you get that raw punk driving aspect to it, which I really, really like. And we'll get more into this when we get into the songs, but there are actually a lot of lyrics that still, like, their social, political sort of slants on a couple of things still sort of hit home today, which is really, really cool and really, really nice to see from bands like this.
Mm-hmm. Brett, what themes and elements caught your attention?
The guitar tone, the only way that I could describe it is thick. I read on the Hüsker Dü database that they used the knockoff era Flying V's from Ibanez, and they ran them through an MXR Distortion Plus and a DBX like rack mount compressor, which like that is why a couple humbuckers through that, and they played the DBX goes out in stereo, or at least in 2 channels, and they ran through 2 solid state Yamaha like half stacks, and they had like some weird Fender amps as slaves. It's kind of weird how they recorded, and sometimes like I was reading how they just went direct from the stomp box into the board on some stuff, like but you know, that came from a website that looked like it was made in 1993. So
I definitely was on that website too, like trying to be like, how do you sound like Bob Mould Hüsker Dü guitars? And it's basically you don't.
well, I mean, I was like, is that a Proco Rat? It sounds, because the Distortion Plus, it doesn't make it sound as compressed. So, well, they had a freaking compressor hooked up to it. So I mean, it's kind of neat, and the fact that they're going for like solid state amplification is kind of weird. They're going for like a different kind of distortion from the one source, as mentioned earlier, told me. But you know, the tone stands out, especially with this kind of music. You know, all of the tones in the album, they weren't all hits. There was some like cheesy piano and some weird drums, but you know, for 1980s experimental stuff, they played with all the toys they had available to them, and it was for the most part a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, what would be some of the key songs that you would point out define this record?
So I'm gonna do the record breakers thing, talk about the opener, something I learned today. This was, I mean, literally the song that introduced me to Hüsker Dü, and it's still one of my favorites of theirs. You get the energy and the aggression of hardcore, but it is fundamentally more melodic than the bands around them. And I think that was, at the time, and especially in the hardcore movement, was melody was kind of frowned upon. And it was, you know, I mean, especially if you get into like, you know, the live scene where bands were just like, we're going to play our whole set in 24 minutes because we're going to play so fast and so hard, and it's just going to be a blur. And Hüsker Dü were like, we're still going to be that, you know, powerful, but we're going to sound good while we do it, and, you know, have a, you know, melody and, you know, songwriting. Shortly thereafter, Never Talking to You Again is the angriest song ever written, as far as I can tell. And it's such like on a punk album to have just a song that's, you know, basically 2 chords and an acoustic guitar. And it's, you know, the softest song on the record, and it is easily the most angry. Sort of the hit of the record there was sort of the two that are the ones that everyone references is, Pink Turns to Blue, which I think in like that song to me just sounds like the 90s emo movement somehow 10 years transported back. Like the early 90s, early emo bands like definitely took from that kind of sound. And then the final song on the album, Turn on the News, which was I think the single, if there was one on this record. This is one of the ones that like made it onto like college radio and stuff. And like Turn on the News, you get sort of everything that is Hüsker Dü. You get, you know, the vocals melting the paint off the walls, but it's still kind of melodic and pretty. And it's really, really goddamn good. And it has a guitar solo on a hardcore record, which you don't always get very often.
Drew, what would be some of the tracks that stood out for you?
Well, we're gonna do the thing that we do on Record Breakers. Something I learned today starts out really strong in my opinion. It was tight. It had sort of the punk rock message that you get from this time, and then that it let you in on the punk rock sound. It sort of hit me like, oh, this is what I'm getting. All right, not expecting this, but let's roll on this. Never Talking to You. The thing with me for punk bands that grab an acoustic guitar, it could either be really good or it could be absolutely horrendous. And there's no in between. So you either got to hit it and you got to know you're going to have it, or you don't do it. They kept it simple. They kept it right. It was effective. And it pushed the lyrics out. Like Pat said, it's a light song. It's a melodic song. It's sort of the softer song, but it's got some like giant middle fingers in it, which I think is cool. Hare Krishna, like what? Like, like literally my notes are what?
Amen, brother. Amen.
Literally,
That's the one that I was thinking about.
What?
If nobody else had
In the
mentioned
context
it, I would have pointed it out.
concept of the album, it's a guy going on a journey. If you've ever been in an airport and run into the Hare Krishna, if you've ever been in a tourist trap in Italy and run into the Hare Krishna, and I have, like, there was a period of time where they were such a thing that, like, when you traveled, you ran into them somewhere, because crazy people.
Yeah, but that doesn't explain why they decided to use a vibra slap every beat for, like, the entire song. Like, kids, if you don't know what a vibra slap is...
I'm just saying how it fits into the album.
No,
I will agree. It is not it's the one song on this album I consistently will just be like, next.
But
Why? I like it. Was fun. This is one of the most memorable songs for me.
It's all about that vibra slap.
I was not expecting. Like, literally, if the entirety of, like, punk rock decided, like, no, we're just gonna trip on acid, like, you would get this song, and it was, okay, alright, let's roll with that, fine. Like, it was cool, though. Like, I enjoyed it for what it was, and, like, once I got that there was, like, I heard the thread, like, I thought there was something going on, but then, like, when I went back and I was reading about it, I was like, oh, this makes a whole lot more sense now. But then, like I said at the beginning, there are songs in here, and the song that points this out to me very, very clearly, that still resonate with sort of what's going on today, is Newest Industry. Musically, I think it was one of my favorites as well. But the lyrics just are sort of that almost timeless feel to them. You can sort of see the current with what they were seeing back then, and it's like that. It sort of is weird looking back on that to see that things sometimes just don't change on certain things.
Mm-hmm. Brett, what would be some of the tracks that stood out for you?
All right, well, I'll go back to Hare Krishna. I was not mad about that song. I was just mad about, like, you know, you every now and then you'll get a really bitchin' song, like, you know, where you'll have that little rattly vibra slap that, like, just a little thing. It's not like, you know, you don't ding the triangle or hit the cymbals in an orchestra every single beat. and it was really loud compared to everything else. So that's the only thing. Otherwise, it was a pretty groovy tune. Yeah, weird. And also completely dates this album. I'll Never Forget You, was a really, really groovy track. Groovy. Although the vocals are kind of rough. That's kind of a theme with this album. Like, for me, it's like, I guess, maybe it has to grow on me. I mean, I didn't just wake up and was like, oh, Geddy Lee, best singer in the world. I can listen to some grating lyrics, but one of the songs that really stood out, like head and shoulders above, I was sitting listening to this and I was like, oh, wait a minute, I gotta write something down about this. Was "Standing by the Sea." Full, progression. It's got this weird sour sounding bass lick repeated over and over, like it's sounds like slightly out of key on one note. It's kind of fun. And they, near the end of the album, they had the Turn on the News was like I'm in a basement club full of sweaty dudes. This is what we got to play while we smell each other. And people can enjoy along with. But there are a lot for an album that has 1 million tracks on it. It was leaning heavily towards more being good than bad. Including there are songs on this album that are just noise. The majority of these are fun songs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is some interesting tracks. And if y'all hadn't mentioned Hare Krishna, I would have brought it up because that was one of the most memorable tracks that hooked me, out of this whole record. And it was just, and to the point where, it seemed like the main thing that caught my attention was that it seemed like almost to the tune of "I Want Candy."
Oh God! You just put that in my head. It's never going to get out of it.
Nope, you're never gonna
can't unhear that. I just may as well delete this song out of my iTunes library.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with Bow Wow Wow.
Absolutely not. All right, let's go back around the horn. Drew, what would be kind of your thoughts on the album overall? Like, what your conclusion would be?
I've said this before and I'll say it again. This is part of the reason why I really like doing this show with y'all. It's getting stuff that I know I should have listened to and I know I should have tried to understand, but I just haven't, and just having a reason to dive into it. It's a really good record. There's a reason that the entirety of the post-hardcore, like late 80s, early 90s emo scene was the way that it was. And a big part of that, I think, if you listen to this record, it's here. Like, you hear, in my opinion, a dozen roses, you can hear where Braid was like getting those inspirations. You can hear where it's coming from. And if you're into that sort of thing, dive in. It's worth the listen.
Mm-hmm. Brett, what would be your conclusion about the album overall?
It's a solid album. It's something that if you want to see how genres grow and morph into other things and see what inspired kids back in the day, that it's this album, it inspired a lot of grunge musicians, it inspired a lot of punk musicians. It's not really like on my it touched me in a special way like Milo Goes to College or Suffer or any of the other really, really awesome punk rock albums, but this really isn't that kind of album. It's more of something that, if you need further reading, this is the place where you want to go. If you're somebody who's not completely into, hammering on drums and screaming and jumping on people, this is a lot more refined than your average punk rock album, which is kind of weird because it's kind of gritty. So go listen to it. Have your own opinions, but I don't know. I'll probably groove out to some of these songs. Groove. Let me say that word some more.
Gary Glitter touched me in a special way, but that's unrelated to music.
That's fucked up, Pete. That is fucked up.
I'm sorry.
Not gonna touch it. Not gonna touch it. Gary did.
Gary did. Yeah, Gary touched it all.
All right.
But yeah, that's beside the point. But that's beside the point. Yeah, it's definitely a record to know. I can't say that it made me feel an epiphany of some kind, but it was definitely a record to know and to understand and to listen to. Patrick, what would be your conclusion about the album overall?
I think this, to me, there's a couple albums that are the missing link between hardcore and then the various incarnations of punk in the 90s. I think you can make a strong case for the Minutemen's Double Nickels on the Dime, sort of expanding what that really like hardcore movement was, and then taking it other places with melody and different kinds of songs. On, if we went back to, the Dead Kennedys that we did a couple of weeks ago, what that sound was, where that was, way more stripped out and melody wasn't really the goal. I think it's a really, really, really good album. I feel like if you're a punk fan, you have to at least be a little bit familiar with this album at some point in your life, just to like, it's like required reading. It's like one of those books they made you read in high school, like The Great Gatsby or some shit. It's not going to be something you love, but it's something you should hear because of its impact on everything that came after it. And because it was it was reaching from what the music was at that moment. It was trying something new and trying to expand it. Kind of like Brett said, how genres morph from one to another. And it's really good lyrically. Like if you dig into the lyrics, they go everywhere and they tend to be pretty good. Musically, I think it's fun. It's a punk record, but it's not just 3 chords and banging on drums. It's more than that. It tries things. I think that's what makes it so good.
Required reading. It's like the music version of the Chocolate War.
I think music of the Chocolate War would be like Sunny Day Real Estate's first record. It's way more that kind of feel.
All right. So, that is our thoughts expanded thoughts on the album. Let's get to our main event of the evening, to our haiku reviews. Let's start with Brett. Brett, what is your haiku?
Well, before I do my haiku, I just want everybody to know at home, we're playing Record Breakers, the original game at home in the back channel, where Aaron Carter released a cover of I Want Candy. And I think I've got my next album that I want to bring to us. But now to the haiku. A very weird album. Heard these guys were important. I'm okay with this.
Mm-hmm.
I Want Candy.
Yes.
Stop. Whoa. More lines than you needed, sir.
All right. So, Drew, what is your haiku?
How did I not know that I had punk rock in store with great melody?
Mm-hmm. My haiku, for y'all is fuzz and noise galore, fun tunes to thrash around to. Didn't quite hook me. And last but not least, Patrick, what is your haiku?
All-time great record, an intense experience. Umlauts can be good.
Mm-hmm. If you want to play Record Breakers, the home game, for everybody out there, you can follow along on our Spotify playlist. Subscribe to that Spotify playlist. And you can follow along with whatever we're listening to at any given time, or you can search it for yourself. On that Spotify playlist is going to be next week's record, and that's going to be provided by Brett. Brett, what do you got for us next week?
Aaron Carter's we're going to listen to the Presidents of the United States of America and their album 2.
Mm-hmm. Wait a second. Of course, you can find us all over the internet. Patrick is at the Swagger. Brett is at Hibbity Baybird, HIBBITY ITYBIBBARD. Drew is at Xtrusive for X. I'm at PD Rave. The show is at 4 Record Breakers. That's the number 4 Record Breakers. RecordBreakersPodcast.com. RecordBreakersPodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Subscribe to us on Stitcher. We're everywhere. We got a RSS feed. You can throw it on anywhere. But give us some shares. Share us, like us, subscribe to us. Give us some feedback. Let us know how we're doing. But that's it. Until next time. Hasta los huevos.
Bootaloo.
Fighting.
Give us some shares. If you're like shares of Apple or Google will be fine.
I would settle for Microsoft shares.